Beyond the borders, the untold reality of Hindus in Bangladesh. Did you know that Bangladesh is home to the third largest Hindu population in the world? More than 13 million Hindus live there today. And yet, a troubling question remains: if such a large Hindu population exists, why has its share been steadily declining for decades? This story is not about religion. It is about history, fear, silence, and the responsibility of institutions. Today, we examine a reality that many prefer to ignore and some are afraid to speak about. This is the story of the Hindu minority in Bangladesh, a story of constitutional promises and the lived insecurity on the ground. This report is not against any community. It stands for human rights, for equality before the law, and for the true meaning of secularism. Here is our detailed investigation.
Today, we're diving into a story that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. It's a story unfolding in the shadows, a story about the complex and often silent reality for the Hindu minority in Bangladesh. It's a story of history, of fear, and it raises some really tough questions about responsibility that we all need to understand. I want to start with just one number: 13 million. It's a huge number, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, it means that Bangladesh is home to the third largest Hindu population on the entire planet. That's a massive, deeply rooted community we're talking about. So here's the puzzle. If this is one of the world's largest Hindu communities, why is it getting smaller and smaller every year? It's not a simple question, and to even begin to find the answer, we have to go back in time. And look, this isn't something that just happened overnight. No, this is a story that has been unfolding for decades, shaped by huge historical events that unleashed waves of fear and created this constant, sustained pressure. Just look at this timeline. It tells a really dramatic story. Back in 1941, Hindus were nearly a third of the population, almost 28%. Then came the seismic shocks. First, the partition in 1947, which triggered this massive, painful migration. Then, the 1971 Liberation War, where Hindus were specifically and systematically targeted. And the result of all that pressure? The community has been whittled down to just 8.5% today. This wasn't some slow, gradual change. It was like the ground just fell out from under an entire community. And this brings us to the core of the problem today. There's this massive gap, a huge conflict between what's promised on paper and what people are actually experiencing every single day. On one hand, you've got the official promise. The Constitution of Bangladesh guarantees religious freedom. Heck, they even officially restored secularism back in 2011. But on the other hand, you have the reality on the ground, which our sources describe as a constant, lingering atmosphere of fear and insecurity that's felt, disproportionately by the Hindu community. Okay, so let's get specific. How does this pressure actually show up? How does it feel? We can really break down the crisis into 4 key areas. You can think of these as 4 pillars that work together to create that constant feeling of insecurity. There's recurring communal violence, and it's not random. It often flares up strategically around elections or religious festivals. Then you have the systematic dispossession of land, which just chips away at a family's economic stability. And holding it all up, an unequal application of the law, and a deep sense of being pushed to the margins, politically and institutionally. Let's just dig into the land issue for a second, because this is huge. There was this law called the Vested Property Act. It used to be called the Enemy Property Act. Yeah, you heard that right, the Enemy Property Act. It was used to seize millions of acres of land from Hindu families. And here's the kicker. Even after the law was changed, getting that land back became almost impossible because of endless legal battles and political roadblocks. So you see, this was never just about property. It was about systematically erasing economic security and a community's very sense of belonging.
And this feeling of being on the outside, you can actually see it in the numbers. While Hindus make up about 8.5% of the population, they hold only around 5% of the jobs in the civil service. In the police and the military, even lower. I mean, when you don't see yourself reflected in the institutions that are supposed to serve and protect you, that sense of security just evaporates.
And that leads to this. This quote just hits you, right? When mobs replace institutions. A truly chilling example of this was the lynching and public burning of a man named Dipu Chandra Das. He was attacked by a mob based on an accusation of blasphemy, with no proof, no trial. When the state steps back and the mob steps in, it leaves minorities in a state of absolute vulnerability. And a crisis like this, it never stays neatly within one country's borders. The violence, the fear, it creates ripples that spread across the whole region, leading to protests and some serious diplomatic fallout. So, what happened next? Protests erupted across major cities in India, with people demanding that Hindus in Bangladesh be protected. It got so tense that the Bangladesh High Commission in Delhi actually had to suspend its visa services. It went from a human rights issue to a full-blown diplomatic standoff. And of course, this ties directly into a much bigger, much more heated debate in the region, especially around India's Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA. That law was intended to give refuge to persecuted non-Muslim minorities from neighboring countries. But it forces everyone to ask a really tough question. Is speaking up for a persecuted minority a moral obligation, or is it a communal act?
Okay, so now we have to zoom out even further and look at the whole geopolitical chessboard, because this is where the tragic plight of a minority community starts to intersect with the cold, hard, strategic interests of nations, and the result, very often, is silence.
Now, the sources we're looking at point to what they describe as a pretty glaring double standard. They argue that when Muslims face violence, the international response is often swift, loud, and collective. But when Hindus face this kind of sustained pressure in Bangladesh, that same response is often muted, if not completely absent. It raises a really uncomfortable question. Are human rights somehow conditional on a person's identity?
And into this volatile situation, other players are making their moves. Pakistan has shown a new strategic interest in Bangladesh. First, there are high-level military and naval visits. Then there's talk of a potential defense pact. Suddenly, the strategic map is starting to look a lot like it did before 1971, which creates a whole new layer of concern for India. And the focus is squarely on the Siliguri corridor, that tiny, super-sensitive strip of land connecting mainland India to its northeastern states. It's a major strategic choke point.
All of this pressure, both internal and external, is having a direct impact on the country's own trajectory. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Bangladesh was being praised as this amazing economic success story, a manufacturing powerhouse whose income per person even briefly surpassed India's. But fast forward to today, and the headlines are all about factory closures, rising unemployment, and growing political chaos. The promise has been overshadowed by turmoil.
So, when you put all these pieces together, what are we left with? I think it all comes down to the price of silence. And it's really a universal question about courage and responsibility.
I think this quote from our source material just says it all. Secularism is not silence. It is the courage to speak against injustice, no matter who the victim is. True secularism isn't about politely ignoring an uncomfortable truth. It's about having the active courage to speak up against injustice, period, no matter who's on the receiving end.
And that really leaves all of us with one final vital question to think about. In the face of suffering like this, what is the true cost, for them and for us, of our collective silence? Thanks for joining us.
This report is not a verdict, it is a reminder. Because secularism is not silence and human rights are not selective. When injustice becomes routine, looking away becomes a choice. And history remembers that choice.